My name is Devin. I'm the New York State historian, and I'm also moderating this panel. So thank you all for coming back from lunch. We were all treated to, I thought, a wonderful lunch keynote by Professor Farber that really gave us a lot to think about, and also brought a lot of things together that we've already been talking about at this conference. I want to echo people from other panels who congratulated Marist and the Hudson River Valley Institute for putting this on. I think it's been a great conference. I remember when a little over a year ago they brought this idea up to me, and I said that would be a dream come true because it happens to be the era that I personally studied. So thank you again to the Hudson River Valley Institute, to Marist for putting this on, to Chris, Colonel Johnson, Tom, everyone. So our session is about the communal movement, among other things. We'll touch on drugs eventually. But I just want to introduce my co-panelists. Kate Daloz is the author of We Are as Gods, Back to the Land in the 1970s, on the quest for a new America. She is director of the Graduate Writing Studies program at Columbia University. She will be going first. Sally Dwyer-McNulty is Marist's own professor of American Social and Cultural History. She's the author of Common Threads, A Cultural History of Clothing in America, in American Catholicism. Her current research explores the history of the Catholic worker farms established between 1936 and 1964, and the experience of workers, families, and visitors in these anarchist rural communities. So join me in welcoming Kate to the stage, and then Sally, and then me.
Hi. Thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me, in particular Sally, who was the one who made the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So just really quickly, to give you before we jump into talking about hippie communes, which is my subject, the way I come into the subject myself is that I grew up in a geodesic dome in northern Vermont that was built in 1971. So generationally, that's my parents moved from the city to bought a piece of farmland with friends. They thought about living communally, decided against it, which I think was the right choice. But they went back to the land. And so growing up in that context, I had a lot of questions about sort of how it worked. And one of the questions was whenever my parents heard us refer to them as hippies, they were like, no, you don't understand. We weren't hippies. The people in the commune were hippies. And I, at the time, was like, I'm not sure the distinction is as important as you think it is. But I actually have come, so, among other things, that raised a lot of questions. I really did want to understand kind of the distinction that they were making. The jury's still out about whether or not they're allowed to opt out of the hippie. Once you build a geodesic dome, I feel like, I don't know if you get to say that you're not a hippie at that point, but anyway, so for me, these questions kind of came out of my own experience in childhood and became intellectual questions, became scholarly questions, and I just found this to be a really fascinating subject and topic, and so I'm primarily a writer rather than a scholar historian, but so I wrote a book that follows three communes two communes in northern Vermont that my parents were neighbors with. So I'm going to show slides from some of those communes and talk about the patterns and threads, social threads that I noticed in doing these studies and talking to the people who live there. And it's going to follow actually in a really unexpectedly, I think, fruitful way from Dr. Farber's keynote address. It's digging in a little deeper to the themes that he brought up. So first of all, so here we have, I'll talk about Craig up here on the tractor. But the commune phenomenon, that people are familiar with the idea of the hippie commune phenomenon, The numbers are very hard to count about how many communes there really were in this time period. The definition of a commune was contentious at the time, is still contentious, and it is, I think it can, a common feature is the way it was domestically organized, the idea that people were living together in a single household and have all kinds of different emphases. Some were, had religious emphases, some had sort of agricultural, some were very radical, some were very political, some were very apolitical, some were, had all these different elements. So even at the time, like the taxonomy was very complicated, but one thing that does come out of this that I thought was really interesting is that the actual, oops. Oh, that's not there. Oh, there we go. The actual time frame is really more constrained than we tend to think about it. And so these, some of these numbers come from a study in 1978, and this sociologist counted, I think, 3 communes, 3 what he would call hippie communes in 1965. By 1967, there were 12. By 1968, there were 100, and by 1970, he basically couldn't count them anymore. There were thousands of them. And then it started to come back down again in the early 70s. So the time period of this really radical boom in hippie communes is not that long. It's pretty constrained, it's pretty up and down. And that what is going on in that time period is this really intense radical rejection. So there are communes in urban contexts and suburban contexts. There's communes everywhere, and the ones I would like to talk about today are in the rural context, the back to the land kinds of communes. So this is the commune I write about. This is its pseudonym is Myrtle Hill. It's in northern Vermont, and this is them in front of their geodesic dome. That is the one that they taught my parents how to build, the one I grew up in. So this is the, and they learned from from what is sometimes called the first hippie commune, Drop City, in Colorado. And so that's, you can see in the picture, they've started trying to use car tops. It worked in, I'm sorry, it was New Mexico. It worked in New Mexico, it didn't work as well in northern Vermont with the climate. But they went around and actually hacked the tops up. They found junkyards and hacked the tops off to get the steel. And then you can see the learning curve that went on. Like the bottom half has steel and then the top half has wood because they needed to finish it. And so this is a portion of the communards who lived at Myrtle Hill. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to go back to this graph. So you can see the time period, it spikes in 1970, and obviously Woodstock is right there as one of the catalysts. It wasn't the only catalyst, but it was an actually pretty important demonstration of what was possible. A lot of people looked at what was possible at Woodstock in particular, what the hog farm had done, feeding people, kind of bringing people together, the fact that they could pull together sort of a community out of a group of strangers and keep people fed, keep people calm, keep people healthy. And that was inspirational to a lot of people, including Craig, who was at Woodstock. He had just gotten kicked out of California for his participation in the People's Park demonstrations, and part of his legal arrangement was that he had to leave California. And so in his telling, he was like, well, we want to go east for this big concert anyway. And so he ended up volunteering at Woodstock in the medical tents and was really inspired. And so he made his way back to northern Vermont, found a bunch of other people who were similar-minded, and in 1970, his father passed away and he received a small inheritance enough to buy a piece of land in northern Vermont. And so they really had this idea of this tabula rasa. They were just what they didn't want. They'd been living in a place that had a farmhouse and they were running water is bourgeois. We don't want that. We want land we're going to build from nothing. And so they got that, and their first structures were these very primitive. Nobody knew what they were doing. None of them had any building experience at all. And the plastic, in this case, that they used was plastic sheeting that somebody had basically collected from the first Earth Day in New York. A group called, I think it was, I've forgotten which exact group it was, but a group that was sort of half in the country, half still in New York, had built what they called the first inflatable geodesic dome, and they covered it in this plastic, and then they brought it up to these hippies in Vermont who were starting a commune. They built all their summer houses out of it. So they had a great time that first summer. Kind of forgot about winter, and to review, they're in northern Vermont, where winter starts September 3rd. And so there was a kind of a scramble. If you'd like to read all about this, and I go into more detail in the book, but they had a great first summer, and they're doing a lot of this, again, radical experimentation. They did eventually, to their credit, finish the dome completely in wood, and then in the background, they managed to build a big house, all of it out of scavenged materials, all of it out of very little prior experience building anything. And so they lived there communally for 2 winters. The top floor of the big house was a completely open sleeping area, which is an intense way to live. And with a group of maybe, at its height, maybe 20 full-time residents, and then people coming and going. So just to go back to this picture of them. So, again, communes everywhere are doing all kinds of similar experiments. There's tons of these very similar experiments happening in this area and really all over the country. And to talk about the radicalism of the time period, they're saying no to a lot of things. I mean, it was one thing that struck me was the extent to which when I was asking people about what was motivating them in these early days, they were really emphasizing what they didn't want. They were really clear about what they didn't want. So they were saying no to nuclear family structure. I thought was an interesting quote earlier in one of the presentations, that the family is the germ of the oppression or something. I can't remember the exact term, but that was a really interesting theme, that the nuclear family was not, they wanted out of nuclear family. They felt that an expanded family would allow for more freedom and more support. They were smashing monogamy, and so the baby that's in the front there, Lorraine, who's the main character in she's a real person, but she's whose story I follow, is holding her baby, and she deliberately did not know who the father of the baby was because she wanted to conceive the Commune's baby. So that baby was born in a structure on the Commune that summer, in what by all accounts was like a magical and blissful and incredible birthing celebration. And as a complete side note, Bernie Sanders, who was in Vermont at the time and was recently arrived, was writing an article about home birth and stopped by and visited sort of right before this picture was taken, and stayed for a couple of days and talked to Lorraine about her experience as a home birth, and wrote up an article, which is now online because you can find all these things. So just as crazy, couldn't predict it, couldn't make these things up. And Lorraine to this day makes a point of saying every time she runs into Bernie, because it's Vermont, so she runs into Bernie, he always asks about Rahula, the baby, all these years later. So in addition to all of these things, that the family structures, they're also smashing capitalism. They're not interested in participating in capitalist structures. In this case, they were selling candles as kind of like a craft. They're trying to do away with industrial food production. They're trying to raise their own food. They ate a lot of rutabagas, but they were trying. This is the sort of dream they had in the beginning. They're interested in challenging gender. It's a thing that surprised me, and I think it doesn't surprise people who are living at the time, but does surprise people when you sort of forget that the feminist movement came in a very specific time period that became late to rural communes. And so in the early days, the gender roles were very strict, they were very traditional. The men worked outside and were done at dinner time, and the women worked all the time and were putting the children to bed and doing all of the domestic labor, and their voices weren't really heard in the decision-making of the group in a lot of ways. And so when feminism came in, that was one of the reasons that it presented a very big kind of earthquake to this idea of community. Also just the places that they're living, architecture, the recycling that's going on. They're against combustion engines. They're against modern technology. They're sort of trying to go back to anachronism. So even when they lived in the big house, they didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity, they burned wood, which again represented a learning curve because they didn't understand green wood, so they were very cold the first winter. So all of these kinds of radical rejections, these categories of this, sort of radical rejection of mainstream American conventions and systems is going all across the counterculture, no matter the context. But in the rural counterculture, it sort of added this element of, again, this sort of tabula rasa, let people imagine in a lot of ways that they could start society from scratch because they could sort of pretend there was nothing there, that they're building up from nothing. even though they weren't aware at the time of how much they were still bringing with them. And they also just on a practical note, they didn't have neighbors in the same kind of way. So there could be a lot of nudity that wasn't quite possible in the same way when they were living closer to neighbors. The drug use could be a little bit more, theoretically, it could be a little bit more openly partaken in, although they didn't really have access. So that was more, the drug use is more theoretical in these places because they just couldn't get it until they figured out how to grow it, and then they had more access. So all to the level of like the radical rejection that's going on is very extreme in the rural counterculture, and it's also, to me, a related phenomenon is the demographic of people partaking in this kind of like expression of the counterculture. The demographic is very narrow. It's overwhelmingly white, not entirely white, but overwhelmingly white. It's people are coming from well-educated, at least access to education, even if they themselves hadn't gone to college, they almost all had access to college, and in some cases PhDs, including my family. My father had a doctorate and sort of was like, wait, what am I doing? I can talk about theories, but can I build a house? So that's a sort of a common line of thinking that I heard from a lot of people. And they also are coming from financially comfortable family backgrounds. And again, some of that is not necessarily in the context of support, like monetary support, but the idea that they are coming from, they're not taking care of their families. Their families are at least comfortable enough that they can be free in that way of family obligation to support their families. So I'm really interested in that demographic, and I want to kind of like walk through it a little bit, in a little bit more detail, what I've been thinking about. So this is another slide. We're going to spend some time looking at Elliot here. He was from the other commune that's a close collaborator of Myrtle Hill. They called it Entropy Acres. And they were they did a better job with the farming than Myrtle Hill did. Myrtle Hill was really, they were rejecting everything. These guys had a little bit more of a narrow focus, so they were really interested in agriculture, and they were really interested in, sustainable agriculture, but self-sufficient agriculture without combustion engines. So they had horses they were doing this experimenting with. They were really into 19th century technology, and because Vermont at the time, the tractors had really only been, this is way northern rural Vermont, the tractors had really only been in since the 50s. People's barns were full of older technology. So these are 19th century technologies that were still new things in the 30s that then by the 70s are really not that old and are sitting in barns and are fixable. And more importantly, the people who knew how to fix them were still alive. And so it's a whole specialization to know how to fix a harness, how to fix a wooden wagon wheel, and they just, by pure luck, there were still people in the community who knew how to do that, so that allowed them to go farther with this experiment than they would have in many, many other places. But just, again, really radical, really experimental, rejecting all these things, thinking in all these ways, and what I want to think about is using this as an example of how much, why they were able to do this, really. And the sort of phrase that I'm thinking of it is social capital. So this idea of like what they were able to do to bring with them, that the people who were making these radical experiments had a lot of social capital. So just to define that really quickly, one of them is financial resources. And so I'm very excited to hear about Millbrook in a second, but in the past I've used that as an example where sometimes it means there's a person who's an heir to a fortune, and this happens a lot, and just says, the heir to the fortune says, my family made this money in a way that I don't respect morally. Here, counterculture, take these finances and use it. So they donate a mansion, or they donate a trust fund or something like that. So there's radical experiments that are actually funded by trust funds or by inheritances. But in some cases, in the case of, let's say, my parents weren't quite as radical as this, but they had been professionals and they had saved up money and they just had a savings account. And that's still more than a lot of people have. So just having financial resources allows for the capital to, in this case, Elliot, his wife at the time was inherited a trust fund. So these horses and this land were all bought with a at that point, I think she was maybe like the 5th generation to receive this trust fund. And this is what she used it for, was to set up land capital in which they could do this kind of radical experimentation that they were thinking about. And then the other part of it that I think, so that I think people are used to this idea. It's like, oh, rich kids can go do this thing. But I think another part of that that I've been thinking a lot about is what does it take to do these experiments? And one of the things it takes is time. You just have to be able to try a lot of things and have them go badly before you turn a profit. And if you have, financial resources, you're able to do that for longer. You don't have 6 months before you're out of money. You maybe have a couple of years before you have to go get a job or do something else. And that time period, that flotation of time period really allows for experiments. And in this case, these guys had an organic carrot crop. They tried to use the horses for it. They successfully grew all of the hay for the horses with the horses. So the horses produced their own fuel for that year. And the carrot crop, they successfully produced carrots, successfully produced a crop of organic wheat, but they did not turn a profit. They did, that year they just hadn't figured it out. But they had a time to go back and do it again. Then another piece of this kind of social capital that allows for it is safety nets. Again, this is not, big news, but when you sort of start to lay it out, it lets you see why the demographic of these very radical experiments is so narrow. So the safety net in this case could be just their own family stability, the fact that they're not being required to help support their young people who are free to do what they want to do and not have to support their parents because their parents have financial stability. In a lot of cases, they have job offers. There's a bunch of cases where people, again, have an offer to go into the family business. They don't want to do it. They want to try something new. They're rejecting that line of work or that whatever it is. But in the back of their head, they know they can go back to the family job, and in some cases they did. In many cases they didn't, but in some cases they did. And what I'm interested in is the confidence that it gives a person who's interested in these radical experiments to actually take action, where that confidence comes from. And one of the things is knowing, well, if my experiment totally fails, I always have this fallback plan, and who's got that fallback plan and how that lets them take these radical steps. Education, that people are coming from educated, or at least from access to education, so that they can go back to that, they can fall back on the jobs that they were prepared for. Professional experience, that they're dropping out, they've quit their job as whatever their job is, they know that they can maybe go back to it. And then the other part of the safety net, I think this is one I think about as from the generation that I am. I've noticed, for example, I have very good friends who grew up in a one-room cabin that their parents built by hand. They didn't have running water until we were all until the early 80s. Late 80s. We were in middle school before this family had running water. They're trucking their water from the stream every day. And those kids went to college, never had, they had a terrible, one of them had an accident at one point, and the parents, the grandparents were able to pay for the health care bills, pay for the education. So the very radical, the choices that the 70s generation took to live in this very radical way, because they had support coming from their own parents, their children were safe in a way that I think if you don't know your children are safe, it's going to put limits on what you're willing to do. And so I just saw that in a bunch of cases, that the parents' affluence protected the children and let that middle generation make those, make these choices that would be hard otherwise. Just a couple quick other ones. This idea of social mobility, how easy it is to move in society. A huge one here we've been hearing it mentioned a bunch of times is whiteness. So that in this case, again, to go back and look at Elliot instead of the points, Elliot, he walked into the local grocery store and looked weird, no question about it, and he would say that himself. But when he cut his hair, or in his case, he could change his appearance and he would blend in. He didn't stand out racially in a way that a non-white radical person in the same context would have always stood out. So the whiteness allowed for blending into the rural community, or that allowed appearance choices to be made that could be amended later if they wanted to sort of slip in to the existing local white rural community. And then also another one that's really hard to put your finger on, but it came up enough when I was talking to people, that education, or that coming from sort of like a high status point in society, just the way that allows you to walk into a room. I just heard over and over again local people saying, well, that guy was so eccentric, he wanted to do all these weird things, and he looked crazy, but I could tell he was a smart guy, he seemed to know what he was doing. And so that sort of untangible air of confidence that having come from the strata of society, being in the room where it happens, that brings with you that kind of confidence. And then also in a lot of cases, just actual access to, structures of power. So again, the same commune that was growing organic carrots, They sold those carrots at Star Market. They're one of the many small organic hippie farms that like opened the market to organics. It helps us eat what we eat today. That, you know, these are among the people who did that. But that connection with the buyer at Star Market was made because of the, you know, because they were in an elite in Boston together. But this, you know, his in-laws and the Star Market owners knew each other, and so that those doors were open in ways for people coming who had dropped out into rural society that were not open at all for all of the local Vermont neighbors. And then this last one, this is one that I was thinking about a lot when Dr. Farber was speaking earlier, this idea of generational confidence. It's one I think about a lot, especially in the context of, you know, why the 60s generation was able to do so many radical things, and why the sort of like level of radicalism seems to have been at a particular peak. And I'm thinking about it in the context of that, you know, that graph of affluence. Like what did that have to do, the baby boomer generation being born into this time of affluence? I think that there's something to just knowing that the American economy is strong and knowing that you can drop out of it without having to worry that the whole thing is falling apart underneath you. There's an idea that just that there was a solidity, I believe, in talking to people, in knowing and the feeling that even though the piece of society absolutely to a lot of people felt like they were crumbling, and the apocalypse felt near, people really were worried about the bomb, they were worried about structures crumbling, and yet there was some element that I just keep hearing over and over again, and I can see the distinction between my own generation and people even younger than me, of just knowing that the feeling that the economy is going to stay strong and that it's possible to like change it, but that it's not going to crumble completely. There's a quote from a sociologist who had been talking to undergraduates from 1958, and so he's writing in 1968, and he noted that he talked to a lot of people who, young people who were worried about the kind of work that they found, very worried about it, worried that they weren't going to find intellectual, passionate work, but nobody was worried about finding a job. There was sort of no kind of, and I heard that over and over again, that people knew that they could drop out and then just go quickly find a job and at least get back on their feet. And then, you know, that to me is, again, like a little element that allows for this experimentation. I'll just say this last little quick thing, that the commune movement kind of dives down again, but back to the sort of like homesteader, single family version of the back to the land movement sort of takes off at the same time and continues further. These are just to show you trend lines. That's even harder to get real numbers for this time period. But the idea that even as the communes are going down, people are, the experiments are, they're learning from this really radical learning curve, and kind of that list that we saw earlier, that we heard earlier at lunch about all of these in food and healthcare and green technology and all of these things. And just as a final note, this is it's Craig again. So his braids are gone, but the experiment that they did, the commune lasted, Myrtle Hill lasted 2 years living communally, and then they kind of split into community and kept cooperating with each other. Craig's next project after the commune was that he started a co-op, and that co-op, I think, it's in a different form. It turned into a health food store, and it still exists now. And it's really, you know, again, one of these pioneering things that leads to the food we're eating today. It is a direct line from this kind of experiment to, they called it food conspiracies at the time, which I love. And if you think about Whole Foods has a history in something called a food conspiracy, that makes me giggle. But you know, that they were able to sort of, the living part of it didn't stay, but the experiments that they found kind of led to another form. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming today, and thank you to the Hudson River Valley Institute again for organizing this panel. So today I am talking about the Catholic worker and a new chapter on the land, and we've been looking at how the Woodstock is or isn't a unique event. Does it stand out in the history of the 1960s or even in American history? And looking at 1969 from the perspective of the Catholic worker and its land movement, I lean away from the pivotal moment interpretation. Instead, the 1960s and early 1970s for the Catholic worker and other committed pacifists was one chapter in a story that had been underway for a few decades and would continue on after the 1960s, even till today. So I want to note that, that the farms in the study of the Catholic worker, just generally kind of among historians, have been somewhat neglected. They have a lot of warts, and I think that that has been a kind of a repelling issue. In his 1981 introduction to Day's memoir, Dorothy Day's memoir, The Long Loneliness, Daniel Berrigan, noted pacifist, wrote, quote, "They started a newspaper, the rest is history. They started a house of hospitality, that too is history. Peter Marin was forever talking about something he called agronomic universities. They started one on the land. That is something rather less than history," end quote. And so I want to, my presentation today is to kind of let you decide for yourself where this should fit into history. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background about this story. So the Catholic worker movement, and I can fill in detail after in the Q&A, but it was always, it referred to a green revolution right from its very beginning in 1933. The agricultural movement was the third prong in their movement. It was a house of hospitality, which was a shelter in New York City that would provide soup and would provide coffee, possibly shelter, clothing for poor people in the city. There was going to be a newspaper. The newspaper went on and continues for some time. And then also these agronomic, the agronomic universities. I should just point out that this artwork, this symbol, is the symbol that's used in the Catholic Worker newspaper as soon as they kind of get underway with their land experiment. You can see the Cairo symbol, but made with farming implements. Peter Marin, there are two founders to the Catholic Worker movement. One is Dorothy Day, who is a convert to Catholicism from kind of a loosely Episcopalian, and Peter Marin, who was a French peasant who emigrated to the United States. He was about 20 years older than Dorothy Day, and so he was known for these easy essays, and this is one of the easy essays that he wrote in reference to the agronomic universities. It was all about responding to unemployment, and so he wanted to get a piece of land and get people back to the land, and that's where he thought that the United States could respond to unemployment. And he certainly wasn't the only one. In Kate's book, she points out the Nearing family to living the good life. And so they also come back from out of this 1930s back to the land generation. So what they did was and there's something else about the farms is they really, both Peter and Dorothy thought that it was on the farms that they were going to be able to create this kind of synthesis, that people were going to have meaning in their lives. They were going to work hard. They were going to be able to feed themselves. They could respond to addiction. There was lots of people living on the margins of society in the Great Depression and beyond that needed. They needed to have purpose, and that they would be able to find that in the Catholic worker farms. This is just an example of the land section of the newspaper, and I just recently got back from Marquette University, where the records are kept of the Catholic worker. And something that surprised me, I knew that the kind of the column had continued for quite a long time. But the column, once it gets going in about 1935, it continues on through the 80s. The Catholic worker movement has a consistent commitment to the land in kind of all different facets, not only living on the land and believing that people should go back to the land, but then also being very conscious of the land as a space where injustice happens. And so there's lots of talk of the land. Sometimes it's one whole page, sometimes it's one article, but there is this kind of consistency with regard to writing and talking about the land. This is a picture of the first farm that they acquired. They rented a farm first. They had a trial experiment on Staten Island. Staten Island was kind of near and dear to Dorothy Day's heart. And then they decided to purchase land. And they purchased this land in Easton, Pennsylvania, which is about 70 miles away from New York City.
And something that's different about the Catholic Worker Farm than perhaps the communes of the 1970s is that it was always very important for Catholic workers to have access to the city, because ideally there were going to be surplus crops, and those surplus crops were then going to go to the city to feed people in the House of Hospitality. And so this is their first farm, and it was quite a learning experience on this farm. This is a group. This is kind of I would say the kind of the steady group of residents on the farm. Dorothy Day is pictured here in this image. Also Peter Marin, older gentleman with white hair. They are flanking Father Roy, Pacifique Roy, and he's important for a couple of different reasons. One, Dorothy Day is, she's quite zealous about her religiosity, and she feels very strongly about having a clergy member living with them on the commune, that he is going to center them spiritually and be able to, give them regular sacraments. And so she really wants him there, as does Peter Marin. But he's also a terrifically handy person. So again, unlike Kate's farm, they were not afraid of electricity, they were not afraid of running water, they wanted that, but they also wanted to live on the land. And so this is the kind of the group that initially started out there. Something you'll notice about this group is that there are more men than there are women. And this is something that is going to kind of come back again as we look at the different communes and kind of the gender politics that take place on their different farming communal experiences and experiments. So one of the projects that the Catholic Worker undertook right away, and again this has to do with this disinterest in separation, is they wanted to bring children from Harlem to the Catholic Worker Farm in Easton and to give them summer vacations. So I guess it's kind of like a fresh air fund, but for kids in Harlem at Catholic locations. And so they brought children in for a week or two, and they would have good meals, they would have fresh vegetables, and sometimes they would bring whole families in, not fathers, but mothers and their children. And so this was a project that they got involved in right away. And in September 37, there was an article in the Catholic Worker, and the title was "Farm Colony Larger Needs Second Farm, 50 Children and Many Visitors Overflowing Houses and Barns." And so it was this was something that certainly Day thought of as a success in their farming commune. She's also eager to have families. And this is one of the families that was kind of an anchor on the farm, of the farm. This is Victor and Eva Smith. And as you can see, they have several small children, and they end up having several more small children. And this is something that initially that Day thinks is going to be something very positive for the farm. But what happens, and this is, so I guess I should just give you a little bit of a broader context. The United States is moving towards the Second World War. We are in a state of neutrality at this point, but moving closer and closer to war. So what happens is that Day begins to get some pushback on the farm. The families speak to her and say, hey, if you want this farm experience to really work and to happen, this is hard work, and we're going to need some support. We're going to need financial support in order to kind of live a true Catholic life, have these children, many children, continue to have children, and we're being, we can't make this farm function and feed ourselves and entertain all these visitors that you have coming in. And so, so we need support. Dorothy she thinks that what should happen is that the reality is that the farm is not really working out quite as smoothly because of the demands of visitors and families, and so maybe Victor should go out to work, and he should bring in money and help supplement the farm experience. So the families, and it's not just this family, it's even Dorothy's daughter,
Dorothy has had a common law marriage before she converted to Catholicism. She had a child, Tamar. Tamar marries at age 18, and she has begun to have a family. And Tamar and her husband David are kind of leaning in the direction of this other family and another family who are saying, this situation is not ideal for us, and how are you going to support us? And Dorothy wants people to kind of figure it out for themselves. They have the freedom to figure it out for themselves, and they don't seem to be figuring it out. So what happens is she's got this, she's kind of got the pushback from the family. She also has a push from outside of the Catholic worker in that, or I should say kind of within the Catholic worker movement more broadly. Dorothy Day was a pacifist. She saw herself as a pacifist and an anarchist, but she was somewhat wavering. She didn't like to out and out disagree with the church. Sometimes she was critical of the Catholic Church, but she didn't want to out and out disagree. And the Catholic Church supported the Second World War as a just war. And Dorothy's argument was that most wars do not meet the criteria. Up until the Second World War, most wars don't meet the criteria of a just war, and therefore that just war argument doesn't really work so often. And what she came to decide was that the Second World War was, like most wars, unjust. And her membership plummeted. So people are fleeing the Catholic worker and saying, I was with you until that. And then they're not with her anymore. And so Dorothy Day is kind of having this crisis of conscience. Is she, can she kind of stick with pacifism? What is she going to do about these families who she sees trying to lead these Catholic lives, but they are not being able to support themselves? And she goes through this kind of, spiritual, she's kind of seeking spiritually, and she brings this priest, a new priest, he's friends with Father Roy, to the Commune, and he has kind of a different flavor of spirituality. He believes in a kind of perfectionism. He says everybody can be a saint, but you have to really want it, and by really wanting it, you need to be willing to sacrifice. You need to be willing to relinquish desire. Dorothy Day, up until this time, was a smoker, by the way. So one of the desires that she had was to light up, and he wanted her to give that up. That's what she did. But he also believed that people needed to, there was hard work that needed to be done, and that included fasting, that included meditation, and prayer. And so here she has a lot of criticism coming from the larger Catholic worker movement with regard to the war. She has the families that are criticizing her leadership, and then she has this kind of new spiritual advice, which is to pay much less attention to farming and pay more attention to your spiritual status. And so again, a kind of a crisis. And in fact, Dorothy Day takes a break from the Catholic worker. But I would say that what happens is World War II, she kind of comes out strong afterwards. She's kind of figured out her spirituality, her politics. She's absolutely unwavering in her pacifism after the Second World War. So she buys this other farm, and she says, I'm going to leave the families. I'm going to let them buy me out, or I'm going to give them the land. I'm going to have a retreat center because it's really important to take care of your soul. But I'm also going to do the farm. I want the farm, and the farm is important for people. And so she buys property in Newburgh, New York, in our neighboring community, and then she also buys farming land in Staten Island again. So she's back on Staten Island, and this is all by 1949. And some historians would like to, make the point that Dorothy Day was more of a city girl, and Peter Marin was the peasant, he was the farmer, and she really only did it to please him. But Peter Marin dies in 1949, and Dorothy Day keeps going with the farms. And so I would argue that she really was quite committed to the land, and that was an important lens for her. So in this, in the post-war period, Dorothy kind of really asserts herself. As you see, as this, she's come into middle age as well. Again, another picture of the farm in Staten Island. So these two images are from 1948 and 1949. And this is just a little evidence with regard to her you know, where she is politically. In the paper, she is talking about why people should not register for the draft. In 1948, there should not be this standing army. This is peacetime and you should resist. And then if you haven't resisted, then how can you get rid of your you know, your draft card, or how can you make sure that your classification is conscientious objector? So she is instructing people in her newspaper about how this is going. And one of the things about having the farm on Staten Island, it allows her to communicate with the city more closely. That had been something that was difficult in Easton, and so it's a priority for her to have, again, that proximity to the city. She wants people to come to the city, she wants conscientious objectors to be able to get away to the country and to have a place to stay, oftentimes before they end up in jail, which is where they go, and which is where Dorothy Day goes in 1955. So she is also against civilian air raid drills. And so this is a picture of Dorothy Day and some of her comrades sitting in Washington Square Park. She had been arrested actually while during the suffrage campaign in 1918, 1919, spent some time in prison. Dorothy never voted, however. She was for women's suffrage, but then she never voted herself. Now she's going to go back to jail in the 1950s because she has really kind of found her political voice. So what happens with, she's happy with Staten Island. Again, Staten Island is one of her favorite places, but the Verrazano Bridge goes in. And so it's going to be the population explosion, and people are developing on Staten Island, and her property value soars. And she says, so what can I do with this money? I can't stand this money, and it's come from, you know, circumstances I don't agree with. I'm going to invest it in a new commune. So again, she wants the farm. And so she decides she's going to go to Tivoli. And so I just want to point out, I don't know if you can see it, but she's already got these conferences that are set up that she wants to happen at the Tivoli farm. How many of you have been to the Tivoli farm? Anyone when you're growing up? Okay, all right, good. We'll get some experienced folks. And so she has this plan, going 90 miles up. But you know, when I see this now in 2019, I think like, oh, I see, you know, kind of bells going off. 90 miles is a long way from the city. So here is a picture of Tivoli. And this is a picture of the, you know, a Hudson. You're from the property in Tivoli, and as you can see, it's gorgeous. You know, it's a beautiful view. It had been like a casino. They called it the casino, and a resort. It had been a camp during the war years. It's an 89-acre property. It's really a stunning a piece of property. It's owned right now by Bryce Marden and his wife, the artist Bryce Marden. And so, so what she does is she's really she's really developed her politics. She's also, I should say, very involved in civil rights. She spent Lent in 1957 at Koinonia in Georgia, where she does, she's doing surveillance of the, kind of the perimeter and getting shot at night. So she's really like kind of right there on the ground with the civil rights movement. So what happens is that again, another picture of Tivoli. You can see, though, too, here the mansion. The mansion is spectacular. And there are actually three very significant buildings on the property. So again, Dorothy is not about a commune that is separate from the community. And so one of her first visitors in Tivoli is the principal of the local school in Tivoli. And he says, we have this summer program, and we'd love to offer the kids swimming lessons, and I see you have a pool. Could our kids swim in your pool? And she says, sure, absolutely. So 5 days a week, kids from Tivoli in the Rec Park program are getting swimming instruction at the Commune. And she's, the completely porous society, at the Commune. I've talked to folks in Tivoli, and they were like, yeah, they were a little weird, but I love the pool. And so they would come to the pool. Here you have this. So that was in 1964. She's you know, one of the things about Dorothy Day is, and the Catholic Worker, is that they're attuned to local issues, but they're at the same time that they're attuned to national issues. So one of the local issues was the tremendous number of migrant laborers that were coming into the Hudson Valley in 1966. And so she was approached about starting a migrant child care center. And she said, sure, absolutely, I want to do it. So she starts this child care center, and she's very concerned about the politics of the land. This is also the time when she becomes acquainted with Cesar Chavez and goes out to California, and she is protesting for grape picking and for lettuce picking. And so she's looking at the problem locally, and she's looking at it nationally as well. So, and of course all of this is going on. The Vietnam War is going on, everything we've been talking about, the civil rights movement, the counterculture. But for Dorothy Day, these issues of inequality have always been around. You know, war has been a problem all this time. And so she is addressing this issue, just like continually addressing this issue, even as, you know, kids are coming to the farm who are, you know, growing their pot plants on the farm, and they're living in the house, and they're just kind of swinging with it. So something that's a little bit different again about the Catholic Worker is it's intergenerational. You have a much older kind of matriarch. She is 67 years old when she comes to Tivoli, and she is ready to like take it on again and do this farm. This is a picture from the, you know, of one of the groups that was there, and you know, again, you can see that there are two older gentlemen and young people, and they're all kind of working together. And again, this is something that is rather unique about the Catholic Worker movement. There's a difference here in these two flyers, so I want to point this out. The Catholic Worker in Tivoli becomes the location for the peace conferences, for some peace conferences in the New York area. And so this flyer on the left is from 1969, and the flyer on the right is from 1970. And what happens with a lot of communal movements, and as Kate alluded to, this kind of intensity, this living together becomes very difficult. And people are coming and visiting in droves. I've met people and they're like, oh yeah, I vacationed there as a child. You know, 200 people just, you know, all over the lawn and in the woods and in the house. And it became very hard to kind of control. And Dorothy, even though she was kind of controlling, didn't believe in control, and so there was always that kind of conflict as well. And so here they provide a lot of information on 1969 about what's going to happen, and you know that you can, you know, these are the lectures. In 1970 they say, less entertainment, no movies, the pool doesn't work. Like, you know what, like only come if you're serious and you want to talk about peace activism, because we're not going to entertain you here. So you can see that there's something up. They're trying to kind of like rein it in a little bit, because it has been so kind of free floating in on the Tivoli site. This is a image from the peace movement, where they would, this is in the back of the mansion, and they're sitting around and talking. You know, I keep saying Catholic Worker, Dorothy is Catholic, but lots of people that came to the movement weren't Catholic, and they didn't partake in any of the Catholic rituals. So, you know, it frequently would be mentioned in, you know, by some of the Catholics, like, oh, there were 6 people at Mass. Well, but the other, you know, 194 were, you know, doing other things. Okay, so I'm just going to tie up here. This is one of the issues at the end of Tivoli. This is Red Ryder here on the left. In the middle is Arthur Sullivan, and then Farmer John. Farmer John's like the last farmer standing on the farm. And so this is, Tivoli is kind of the end of a life cycle of this story about being kind of back to the land. But back to the land is going to continue. Red Ryder is what Dorothy would call a knight of the road. He was a man who wandered, who just kind of ended up at the farm and decided to stay. The planting, you're probably saying, what are they eating? Okay, that becomes an issue. They keep trying to, but there's so many issues to talk about and to demonstrate on and to, get lawyers because we got to get out of jail. So there's a lot going on. And then finally, and I guess I'll leave it with this. Am I out of time?
Yeah.
I'm out of time. Okay. So this was such a kind of a startling document to find in an archive. It's like exactly what, like, I didn't imagine I wanted it, but I absolutely wanted it because someone on the farm did a kind of a map of the fissures, of the social fissures. Like these are the birthwriters, these are the intellectuals, these are the lifers who believe in vegetarianism and macrobiotics. These are the traditionalists, and these are the factions that have come up as a result of all living together in this intense experience with a really long winter, as Kate pointed out, a really long winter in Tivoli. They talk about the winter. So this is something that is kind of endemic to the communal situation. Okay, I fibbed. I'm gonna have one more. Okay, and it's this one here. Okay, this is the last one. I would say this: the farms don't go away. The farm, they decide, as they did in other situations, to sell. So they sell the Tivoli farm, but they buy a new farm in Marlborough, New York, and so they are gonna move on. These experiences are difficult, but the Catholic worker retained this commitment to the land, and also in some ways a lot of their politics came together because they were so concerned. Cesar Chavez was really this great learning experience for the Catholic worker and for Dorothy Day, but then also the No Nukes movement and kind of looking ecologically at the planet and what we have to do to protect it and be responsible for it. So the Catholic worker really moved right from kind of the farm and the war movement to the peace movement and the environmental movement through the No Nukes. Okay, that's what I got.
I'm, again, Devin Lander, New York State historian, and what I'm going to be talking about has been mentioned a couple of times by Professor Brinkley, Professor Farber. Millbrook Commune, which is just north of here, the village of Millbrook in Dutchess County, about, 15 miles north of here. That's me. Just a little bit of background before I get into the gist of my presentation. So the origins of the commune begin at Harvard University in the early 1960s. On the left you see Timothy Leary. On the right is Richard Alpert, who both of them were on the faculty of the psychology department at Harvard. Leary was a lecturer. Alpert was a tenure-track assistant professor. It's really a confluence of three things at Harvard that set the path towards Millbrook. One was both of these gentlemen being kind of radical psychologists. They were very heavily involved in the humanistic psychology movement that was gaining popularity by the late 1950s, early 1960s. The second thing was they were both also around the same time becoming interested in Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, things like that. Mostly because around the same time, Aldous Huxley was a visiting professor at MIT, and Alan Watts was a visiting professor at Harvard, so they were running in those circles, so to speak. And the third, of course, is psychedelic drugs. In 1960, Timothy Leary had his first experience with what is known as magic mushrooms in Mexico when he was on summer vacation, and he came back with the light bulb on, thinking that psychedelics were going to be the answer for the issues that he saw in society, but more importantly at the time, was going to be the answer to the problems that he saw with psychotherapy. He had done an analysis of psychotherapy in the mid-1950s that showed that it had dubious success rates. People in psychotherapy had that came out of psychotherapy tended to have the same problems as they had going in. So he kind of looked at his field and said, oh no, what can we do to make things better? So for him, the answer was psychedelics. Immediately, by 1961, he had started a program at Harvard called the Harvard Psilocybin Project, which did a series of experiments. I won't get into too much of that, but it caused a problem. They immediately drew, well, not immediately, but by 1962 it started to draw the ire of their colleagues within the psychology department and within the administration at Harvard, as well as the media. And part of the reason for this was they were very loose on their definition of the scientific experiments that they were doing. And specifically, they were taking psychedelics outside of the laboratory. Now, this was actually was part of Leary's philosophy at the time. Humanistic psychology sought to kind of tear down the boundaries between the patient and the therapist. And so for Leary, this meant, you know, we can't take psychedelics in the laboratory setting. We have to take them in a comfortable setting. Set and setting was something that he was one of the originators of, the idea of set and setting with taking psychedelics. But anyway, they start drawing the ire of their colleagues first, and then the media and the FDA. And you start seeing problems arise at Harvard. By the spring of 1963, Leary is saying that he has been thrown out of Harvard. Actually, he just was not. He was a lecturer. He was not tenure track faculty, so his contract was not renewed. And the real reason was he stopped going to class. So, because he was, at this point, he was moving on. He said he was moving beyond science and beyond Harvard. So he had established a not-for-profit group to do his research through called the International Federation for Internal Freedom, so IFIF. And he was busy on the West Coast kind of fundraising for IFIF with this idea that he was going to set up a series of transcendental communities around the United States. Richard Alpert was actually fired from Harvard. You see on the right there the New York Times article. He was fired because the Harvard Psilocybin Project had agreed not to give psychedelics to undergraduate students, and he violated that promise. So one of the things that this presentation builds on is the work of the media historian Stephen Siff, who came out in 2015, came out with a book called Acid Hype, American News Media and the Psychedelic Experience. What I've done is try to build on his excellent work with the microcosm of Millbrook. So the influence of the media and what was happening nationally on the situation between the Millbrook group and the villagers. So just a little bit of background on that. But before we get to that, so they're thrown out of Harvard or not renewed at Harvard. Their first stop was Mexico. They had thought that they would establish a transcendental community, really a commune, very early commune, actually, too, as Kate has showed us. This is 1963. They thought that they would establish one in Mexico. That lasted about 6 weeks. At this point, they were celebrities. The media was following them around because they had been ousted from Harvard. As you see, this is a Saturday Evening Post article from 1963. The Mexican government was not happy with that publicity. Immediately flew into action. They didn't have the correct visas and permits, so they were ousted from Mexico. They tried to set up shop in the Caribbean. That lasted even less amount of time, a few weeks. They were ousted from the Caribbean, so they returned to Massachusetts, basically homeless, small group, 15 to 20 people at this point, who were associated with the Psilocybin Project, some of them were graduate students of Leary's, others were people that had come into contact with the Psilocybin Project, either through Aldous Huxley or through Allen Ginsberg, who came to Harvard in 1961 and took psychedelics with Leary and then introduced Leary to the literary and beat elite of, if that's even a term, of New York City. So they come back to Massachusetts, and one of the people that Leary and Alpert had been introduced to was a woman named Peggy Hitchcock. And she was a member of the Hitchcock family who were heirs to the Gulf oil fortune. Very wealthy family. Her mother was a Mellon. And her brothers, she had twin brothers who had just in 1962, had purchased around a 2,000-acre estate in Millbrook. And she suggested to Alpert and Leary that they contact her brothers, who were, I think, 21 or 22 at the time. And she said, if you give them psychedelics, maybe they'll let you live on the estate. I don't know if that was what turned their heads, but they definitely allowed the group to live on the estate and live in the big house where I had the picture at the beginning. That house was somewhat run down, but the group was allowed to live there, did have power and all of that for a nominal fee a year, $100 rent or something. So they moved their group into this idyllic situation in Dutchess County. Again, what I want to focus on is the relationship between the commune and the group and the village itself. Initially, this is a very, if not totally accepting, it's a very benign reaction that the villagers had. We see an editorial written by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert thanking the village of Millbrook and those in the community for welcoming them, even though they had somewhat of a checkered past, and there was media reports of them being these people that are experimenting with this strange mind drug. They actually became, within the community itself, celebrities. The Millbrook Roundtable, which is the local paper, did this feature when the New York Times came to interview Leary and Alpert. This is at the Millbrook Diner, which is still there. And you can see that, it made kind of front page news. Hey, we've got celebrities living within our community, even though they were somewhat notorious. So that interview led to this article that came out in the summer of 1963, which essentially says exactly that these controversial figures have moved to the small village of Millbrook in Dutchess County, but that they're not causing any disturbance, and that there's interviews with people in this article that say they're nice people and they're clean cut, and you can see that, right? These are the majority of the early group that moved to Millbrook. I mean, these are PhD, almost all of them, or high-level college-educated, college faculty types. These are not the hippies that we would see later on. So again, the reaction is somewhat benign. Actually, one of the people that's interviewed in this newspaper article is named John Kading, who owned the village newsstand, and Timothy Leary would come in every day and buy the Boston newspaper from him. He's still alive, and I've interviewed him as part of my oral history project, and just had a great event at the Millbrook Historical Society last month with him, where we were talking about this group and going through some of this. This is another article as a result of that New York Times article, kind of a tongue-in-cheek piece about saying now that John Kading is a celebrity because he was quoted in the New York Times. During this time, though, we're seeing a few things happen. 1964, again, the media continues. Leary and Alpert are continually in the media, not just locally. This is a Newsweek article from June of 1964. 1964 also sees the group starting to look, actually what this article is about, looking for ways to fundraise. Although they lived at the largesse of the Hitchcock family, the Hitchcock family was not paying the grocery bill and that kind of stuff. So they still had to figure out ways to raise money for a group of people that fluctuated, 20s. There was, around this time, there were maybe 20 to 30 people who were there kind of consistently, but it would fluctuate. So they came up with this idea to have paid retreats on the weekends. So this is what this article's about, where you could pay money and visit the commune at Millbrook and undergo the psychedelic experience without drugs. Sounds odd, right? But they did that in a variety of ways. They were actually one of the originators of the light shows that became really popular back later in the 60s, and the Grateful Dead and Pink Floyd in London in the later 60s was doing these light shows. They did things like that. They coupled it with kind of a multimedia experience, so it's music, it's light shows. They also did things like change the color of food. So your milk would be black and your eggs would be green, and to try to to try to establish, I don't know what really, frankly, that was about, but it was all the idea that you're going to see things differently. Other things that they were doing, which were somewhat ahead of the time. Now, at the same time that this was going on, the Esalen Institute was up and running by 1962 in California. It was doing similar things with workshops and even more so than Millbrook. But I think there's evidence that the Millbrook group was looking at the Esalen Institute as a model and saying, hey, we should be doing this on the East Coast. But they were doing things like yoga. They were doing things like talking about macrobiotic diet, and so it was really a combination of some of these things we've talked about already. Again, things change even more dramatically, though. This is the real point where the relationship between the group and the village itself starts to change, and that's when Leary was arrested at the end of 1965. He was traveling to Mexico to spend Christmas break in Mexico. He was stopped actually at the Mexican border and sent back, which is a really strange story. He was stopped there, sent back, stopped at the American side, and that's when he was searched and they found marijuana. Actually, it was in his daughter's possession. He took the blame for it, and he was convicted and received 30 years in prison and a $30,000 fine for less than an ounce of marijuana. So you can see. But what really happened was the blow up nationally in the newspapers, television, as well as the print media in general, negatively towards Leary. It had been somewhat negative already, at least questioning when they were thrown out of Harvard and Mexico. Now it was, Timothy Leary is a convicted drug felon. Shortly after this, in the spring of 1966, the local authorities in Millbrook, led by the Dutchess County District Attorney Heilman and Sheriff Quinlan, raid the Millbrook estate. And we see the first raid happening in April of 1966. There were 41 people there, so we can get a decent head count. Some of these people were just visiting. One of them was actually a journalist who was staying overnight because she was interviewing Timothy Leary's daughter. But they did find some small amounts of marijuana and things like that. Interestingly, for those who don't know, one of the assistant district attorneys at the time was G. Gordon Liddy. So G. Gordon Liddy was in my research and discussions with some of the folks who were part of the law enforcement community at the time, was very big on trying to be the person to bring Leary down. So we keep that in the back of our minds. Again, with the media, with these, the raids and things, and this is happening nationally too. We start seeing, this is around the time when, as Sif outlines in his book, the national media, the national media's opinion of psychedelics has changed from something that could be of interest to science and is has potential for to do things like help alcoholics and things like that, into something that is a dangerous or frightening threat, as you can see in the Poughkeepsie Journal talking about. And played out locally, it's in the backyard, right? It's Timothy Leary is right up the street, and he's the one that's causing all of this, at least in some people's mind. Again, example of Leary was kind of everywhere at this time. He kind of bumped into everybody. He was also asked to testify before a Senate inquiry into LSD in 1966 in May. Again, raising his profile even more, he got into a heated exchange with Ted Kennedy, actually. The transcripts are pretty interesting if you read those, the back and forth between two of them. But again, he's constantly in the media. And that was one of the things about Leary, was he didn't back down from this, he never backed down from the confrontation, but he also never saw a reporter that he didn't want to talk to. And, so he's in the headlines saying that the sheriff is harassing them unjustly, the raids are unjust. Actually, the raids, first of all, they never found psychedelics. Mostly I think because they didn't know exactly what they were looking for. And even the marijuana that they found, those convictions were thrown out because they had improper search and seizure. 1967, again, this is an example. This is when the television has caught up with this. There was a BBC special. A BBC crew came down and interviewed Leary. He was also on NBC News. But one of the things I want you to note is in these national and local headlines, there's always, it's Leary, and it's Millbrook, right? So it's this constant refrain of, LSD, Leary, Millbrook. That starts to bother people. By September 20th of 1966, Leary decides to form his own religion, which he called the League for Spiritual Discovery, LSD. And this is the time when he comes up with the turn on, tune in, drop out mantra. And we can get into more discussions about that. But the real reason he did this, or one of the reasons, and I think, there was some genuine belief there, but it was a way for him to fight the legal battles. He actually claimed in his Laredo bus that he used marijuana because he was a practicing Hindu. So he was trying to follow the Native American Church's lead and get religious exemptions for anyone who could say that they were religiously using these substances. Again, locally, things continue to, this is the spring of 1967, there's a school board meeting in which one of the topics, and if you read the newspaper articles and talk to the people that I've spoken to in the village, one of the main fears was that LSD was leaving the estate. Leary was somehow corrupting the youth of the village. And so when this was put on a school board agenda, which normally would generate, a meeting would generate 20 or 30 people, 300 people showed up. And if you read the reporters' accounts from that, there was, some people were saying, let's go up there now and burn them out of there. And, it was really there was a lot of rancor and a lot of fear, really. And again, this is being played out in the national media. It's being as Stephen Sith called it, a moral panic. Essentially, was happening in Millbrook. Here we see a 1967 article from the New York Times. Remember the New York Times article from 1963 saying how benign the group was, and Millbrook, the village, was welcoming them, no problems. Now we see language changing. They're a drug cult, and also the village fears an influx of addicts. So we start seeing terminology like that they're not just a commune or a communal group interested in doing research, they're a drug cult. This is one of my favorite op-ed cartoons that Glenn Van Bramer, who was a local reporter for the Roundtable, and I actually was somewhat sympathetic to Leary, but this kind of sums it up. If you see the media and the television screaming LSD, Leary, Millbrook, and Leary looking like a mad scientist, saying, I put Millbrook on the map. Why aren't you happy? But one of the things that I've come to realize too is we talk about the complexity of history and the complexity of the 60s. It was not everyone in the village versus everybody on the commune. It seemed that way maybe at first, and certainly maybe the majority of people wanted them gone, but there were actually people within the community who sympathized with Leary. And this we can see in some of Glenn Van Bramer's editorials and cartoons. One of the issues that the sheriff, Quinlan, had was he set up a roadblock around the estate and basically pulled everyone over who drove by. And he had a lot of villagers who were, it was like a Saturday afternoon in the summer, who were pulled over and their cars were searched. And, so that kind of angered people. The other thing that was a kind of a criticism of the law enforcement was in 1967, during one of the raids, and they periodically would raid the estate. And one of the raids, Leary's, I think he was 18-year-old son, was arrested, Jack Leary, and taken to Dutchess County Jail, and they cut his hair. He had long hair, and they shaved his head. And the media got a hold of that, and really, as you can see in this editorial, and Graham Bramer's editorial, really took the sheriff to task for that. So you see this complexity even within the small village that had, the LSD capital of at least of the East Coast. There was still a conflict between overstepping reasonable bounds, personal freedom, things like that were being played out in Millbrook. What ends up happening though by 1968, so this all happens before Woodstock. Leary moves, and actually what happened was the Hitchcock family threw everybody off the estate. The continued law enforcement involvement, eventually one of the Hitchcock brothers himself was arrested, so the family decided, all right, nobody's going to be on the estate at that point. So by 1968, February of 1968, Leary essentially had moved to California. Even kind of before this, he was back and forth a lot. He was at the Human Bee Inn in 1967. Was really starting to establish himself more on the West Coast, and moved, and the group kind of dispersed. But I will say in summary, and I know we're running out of time for questions, but as Professor Farber said, the influence of Leary continues beyond Millbrook, and even though Millbrook is what I look at, obviously Leary continues on and is in the headlines consistently throughout the rest of the 60s. And though he was not at Woodstock, certainly those who were influenced by him and the generation that looked to psychedelics as being a possible answer to some of their problems and some of the problems they saw in society were certainly evident at Woodstock. So with that, I don't know if we have any time left. 1 minute, he says.
One question of each.
Okay.
What happens to Alpert? He kind of drops off the story here.
I should have said, there's many things I didn't have time to say, but Richard Alpert became Ram Das, who is still alive. He lives in Maui, and became one of the most popular New Age gurus of the late 60s and 70s. He wrote Me Here Now, a series of books. He's still around, actually.
Okay, thank you. I recognize the name.
He's like 102 or something.
No, you're thinking Albert. You're thinking Hoffman.
Hey Kate, I've got a question for you. Wonderful project. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. You casually mentioned that some of the local communards started to grow marijuana. I'm curious, to what extent did any of the folks in their network or they themselves start to become serious producers of marijuana and distributors of it as a way to make a living?
That's a great question. I'm like, without giving spoilers for anybody, they were really serious about it, and the history of marijuana production in the U.S. is completely fascinating. It was not something I thought about before I started this project, but it really began, grassroots, because they couldn't get their hands on it. And I know, sorry, terrible accidental pun. But they started growing their own. And just to make a long story short, what they started with was a Mexican strain that didn't grow well in northern Vermont. It was okay in California and Hawaii, but it didn't grow well in the Northeast. And then somebody came back from, I'm not making any of this up, it's an amazing history, but they came back from Afghanistan with a cold weather strain that grew well in the Northeast, and it completely revolutionized what kind and the potency of, and it was, everyone I talked to, my parents were very straight-laced, not particular. I've never seen my mother drink more than half a glass of wine, and they grew this Vermont green in their garden because everybody did. And everyone was like, it was awful, it gave you a headache, you wouldn't want it, and then suddenly this this other strain came in, and suddenly it got potent, and it was also the same that happened around 1975, I want to say, so it's the same time period where the whole drug culture is changing. It stops, in Vermont, the actual marijuana that people had their hands on went from being kind of awful and readily available because they were growing it themselves to quite strong, and then there became a whole culture of like stealing each other's crops, because there was a really great picture of sorry, her name's escaping me, but of a woman with her arms full of the marijuana crop, which is in the full picture, she doesn't have any clothes on, she's just holding an armload of marijuana. The Roberta Price, thank you. But the fact that, someone said it, you could go in, you could sneak into someone's, property and steal their whole marijuana crop and walk away with it at the right time of year because you could carry it out, it wasn't heavy. And so that started happening. So the commune that I write about, that I call Myrtle Hill, part of the reason I call it Myrtle Hill is, they grew marijuana and they, somebody went to jail for it. Another part of the thing that happened in the community that was a little bit harder to write about because it didn't all go through the legal system, so there was a lot of stuff I was not allowed to say. There were internal conflicts in the group that because they were growing marijuana, they kind of couldn't go to the police about some of the other stuff that was happening in the group because they couldn't invite law enforcement. And so that's a really interesting turn in that same time period, that when people took on this kind of like felonious activity, it actually, it meant that they couldn't protect each other in other kinds of ways in the community, and it had a really terrible effect.
For Kate, I have a question and a comment. The question is, at Myrtle Hill, the baby that the mother didn't want to know who the father was, did that baby ever try to find out paternity?
Again, yes, and in the time that I was researching this book, she found out who her father was, so, in the last 5 years. And the comment from the father when she finally found him was, I knew I was your father. Those people couldn't do math. That's all he had to say. He had to be found in the hills of Mexico, where he was growing marijuana also. So it took her a while to get in touch with him, but when she finally got in touch with him, that was his pull quote. And I found out because Lorraine had heard from her daughter that had happened, and she wanted me to tell, she knew I was in touch with a bunch of different people and she was like, oh, next time you talk to Nancy, can you tell her that this is what, Rahula's father had to say that? I was like, do you just want her phone number? I'll just, why don't you call her and then you can tell her. I feel weird that I'm involved in this, communication 40 years later. So yeah, recently she found out.
But my comment is, you talked about the generational confidence, and I somewhat disagree that was so true for us. We baby boomers at that time, because we grew up with our parents constantly talking about the Depression and World War II and the threat of communism and nuclear wars, so that it wasn't quite as easy as you're kind of portraying.
Yeah, I understand, and to me, actually, it's the tension between those two, the sort of, and again, that image of the children ducking under the desks, Peter Coyote, actually, during his book, or I interviewed him at one point, said really interestingly, we felt that all these things, that our parents were telling us, everything's fine, just get under the desk real quick in case there's like a nuclear, and that kind of tension between being told, everything's fine, we've got it under control, but except for that we don't, and that this idea that the children had to take control, that the adults weren't even paying attention to, they were like, that's visibly a terrible plan, the desks are not going to save us, and we can see that, and the adults won't admit it. And so I'm not disagreeing at all, but I find that there's a tension, and in that particular case, I'm thinking less about the tension between the baby boom generation and their parents than my generation and the generation below me, how much confidence we have that we can just get a job. The number of people who were like, oh, I have a PhD, I'll just walk away from it, kind of in an implicit understanding that if you wanted to go back, you could go back. And I'm just, I work with graduate students now, and there's nothing like that kind of confidence, and that your PhD is going to guarantee you a job later. So that's kind of more what I'm talking about. Thank you.
I think we are out of time. Get ready for the next session, which is at 3:45. Please go check out